She saved a girl from the street. When she discovered it was a mobster's lost daughter, everything changed. Each like and comment helps heart pulses touch even more hearts. Antonella adjusted the weight of the sleeping girl in her arms while observing the imposing mansion before her. The golden gates gleamed under the afternoon sun, contrasting with the high walls that protected that world to which she had never belonged. Isabella moved slightly, her small fingers gripping Antonella's simple blouse even tighter, as if she knew she would soon be separated from the only person who had protected her for the past 3 days. Antonella's heart tightened at the thought of the approaching farewell, but she knew she was doing the right thing. "You're almost home, little one," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as the child. The gate opened silently after she rang the golden bell, and 2 men in dark suits appeared, their faces serious and expressionless. Antonella felt a shiver run down her spine as she noticed how they analyzed her, as if she were a potential threat. Her worn shoes echoed on the marble floor as they escorted her through the perfectly maintained garden, where each flower seemed to have been positioned with military precision. Her hands trembled slightly when the main doors of the mansion opened, revealing an entrance hall that seemed to have come from a movie. "Mr. Greco will be here in a moment," said one of the security guards, indicating a leather sofa that probably cost more than Antonella's annual salary. Isabella awoke in Antonella's arms, her large dark eyes blinking confusedly as she looked around. The girl had spent 3 days in Antonella's small apartment, eating simple sandwiches and sleeping in the single bed. But now she was back to the luxury she had known since birth. Antonella felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Perhaps it was envy. Perhaps it was just the painful awareness that some were born in palaces while others struggled to pay rent. Little Isabella looked at Antonella with those eyes that held too many secrets for a 5-year-old child. "Is the pretty lady leaving?" asked the girl, her small voice echoing in the silent hall. The sound of firm footsteps descending the staircase made Antonella look up, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. Pietro Greco descended the marble steps with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what his place in the world was. Tall, broad shoulders that perfectly filled the dark suit, black hair combed back, he carried a presence that dominated the environment without needing words. But it was his eyes that held Antonella in place, dark as night, penetrating as if they could see through any mask or lie. When he looked at her, Antonella felt as if she were being evaluated, weighed, judged. "Daddy," shouted Isabella, slipping from Antonella's arms and running toward her father. Pietro knelt to receive his daughter, and for a fraction of a second, his mask of control completely collapsed. Antonella saw the raw relief in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he touched the girl's face, as if he needed to be sure she was really there, safe and whole. It was a moment of such pure vulnerability that Antonella felt as if she were intruding on something sacred. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the emotion disappeared, replaced by a calculated coldness that made Antonella take an involuntary step backward. Pietro kissed his daughter's forehead and stood up, his eyes meeting Antonella's with an intensity that made her swallow hard. "Isabella, go with the nanny," he said, his deep voice echoing in the hall like an unquestionable command. A middle-aged woman appeared as if she had been summoned, extending her hand to Isabella with a warm smile. The girl hesitated, looking at Antonella with those large eyes that seemed to beg her not to leave. Antonella knelt at the child's height, holding her small hands between her own, trying to ignore the sensation that Pietro was observing her every movement with predatory attention. His expensive perfume reached her, woody, masculine, completely different from the cheap soap she used. "You'll be fine here with your daddy," said Antonella, her voice coming out more choked than she intended. "He loves you very much, I can see it in his eyes." Isabella hugged Antonella tightly, whispering softly in her ear words that made her heart break a little. "You're different from the other people who come here," said the girl, her innocence cutting deeper than any blade. Antonella looked over Isabella's head and found Pietro's eyes fixed on the two of them, an indefinable expression crossing his face. There was something there she couldn't decipher, curiosity perhaps, or recognition of something he didn't expect to find. The nanny finally managed to take Isabella away, leaving Antonella and Pietro alone in the silent hall. The echo of the child's footsteps disappeared down the corridors, and the silence that followed was so dense that Antonella felt the need to fill it with words. "I found her in the square near the community center where I work," Antonella began, her words tumbling out due to the nervousness his presence caused. "She was alone, frightened, couldn't say where she lived. It took me 3 days asking everywhere, until I discovered she was a Greco." Antonella noticed how he didn't blink, as if he were memorizing every word, every expression of hers. There was something almost predatory in the way he observed her, like a feline studying its prey before striking. "She stayed at my house these days. I didn't want to call the police because, well, she seemed afraid of uniforms." The words died in her throat when he took a step toward her, further reducing the distance between them. Pietro stopped just a meter from Antonella, close enough that she could see the small lines around his eyes, signs of sleepless nights or worries he carried like invisible burdens. He studied her for long seconds that seemed to stretch for hours, his eyes traveling over her face as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. Antonella felt the blush rise up her neck, a mixture of embarrassment and something more dangerous that she didn't want to name. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying an authority she had never encountered before. "Thank you," he said simply. But there were layers of meaning in that single word that made Antonella's heart inexplicably race. The silence extended between them again, heavy with unspoken words and tensions that neither fully understood. Antonella nervously fidgeted with the strap of her bag, conscious of how her simple clothes contrasted with the luxury surrounding them. Pietro removed a leather wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket, his movements precise and calculated, like everything else about him. He counted out some notes, more money than Antonella earned in 2 months, and held them out to her. The offer hung in the air between them like an invisible barrier, a cruel reminder of the distance between their worlds. Antonella looked at the money, then at his face, seeing something that could have been disappointment in his eyes. "I can't accept that," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Pietro frowned, a wrinkle appearing between his eyebrows, as if he were genuinely confused by her refusal. "Everyone has a price," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice that didn't match the harshness of his words. Antonella felt a spark of irritation cut through her embarrassment. Who did he think he was to assume she could be bought like merchandise? She straightened her shoulders, finding courage in an indignation she didn't know she possessed. "I didn't do this for money," she said, each word loaded with a conviction that made something shine in his eyes. "I did it because a child needed help. It's as simple as that." She saw genuine surprise cross his face, as if concepts like selfless kindness were foreign languages in his world. He put the money away slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, as if trying to decipher a code he had long forgotten how to read. Antonella felt a shiver run across her skin under that intense gaze, a mixture of fear and something more dangerous that made her pulse quicken. There was something about him that attracted her against all logic. Perhaps it was the vulnerability she had glimpsed when he embraced Isabella, or perhaps it was simply the dangerous magnetism that men like him naturally carried. "You're different," he finally said, his voice so low that she had to lean slightly to hear him. The words echoed between them, carrying a weight that neither could fully explain. Antonella felt it was time to leave, that each additional second in that place pulled her into deeper waters than she knew how to swim in. She took a step toward the door, but stopped when she realized he hadn't moved, that he continued to observe her with that disturbing intensity. "Isabella is a special girl," she said, trying to break the tension that grew between them like a rope stretched to its limit. "She's lucky to have a father who loves her so much." So there was an unformulated question in her words, a curiosity about how such a sweet child could come from such a dangerously cold man. Pietro tilted his head slightly, a gesture that could have been agreement or simply recognition that she had seen through his defenses. "No one has told me what to think about my own daughter for a long time," he said, but there was no irritation in his voice, only a genuine curiosity that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Antonella realized she had crossed an invisible line, that somehow she had managed to make this powerful man lower his guard for just a moment. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, she felt a strange sense of victory. She headed toward the door, her steps echoing on the marble, aware that he was watching her every move. When she reached the entrance, she turned one last time, meeting those dark eyes that seemed to engrave her image in memory. "Take good care of her," said Antonella, knowing they were the last words they would exchange. Pietro remained motionless as Antonella walked toward the gate, escorted by the same security guards who had received her. He watched her until she completely disappeared from sight, a strange, indefinable sensation settling in his chest. For years he had built walls around his heart, had learned that feelings were dangerous luxuries in his world. But there was something about that woman, in her genuine refusal of money, in her sincere concern for Isabella, in her courage to look him in the eyes without fear, that had cracked his defenses in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. He turned his back without further words, climbing the staircase with mechanical steps, but he still felt the weight of those brown eyes on him, as if she had left an invisible mark that he couldn't erase. A week had passed since Antonella had returned Isabella to Pietro, but the feeling that those dark eyes were still watching her wouldn't leave her in peace. Sitting at her desk in the community center, she tried to focus on the reports of the assisted children, but her fingers trembled slightly over the keyboard of the old computer. For the third time that morning, she looked through the window and saw the same dark car parked across the street, with tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Antonella's heart raced, a mixture of fear and something she didn't want to admit, a strange expectation that perhaps it was him. "Why can't I get him out of my head?" she whispered to herself, hating the vulnerability in her own voice. The day dragged on with torturous slowness, every noise in the street making Antonella look up expecting to see Pietro walk through the center's door. She had helped dozens of children over the years, returning them to their families without ever thinking twice about it. But there was something about Isabella and her father that had settled in her mind like a song she couldn't stop listening to. As afternoon began to fall, Antonella packed her things slowly, checking once more if the car was still there. It had disappeared, but the sensation of being watched persisted like an itch she couldn't reach. "I'm getting paranoid," she muttered, trying to convince herself that she was imagining things. The way home had never seemed so long. Antonella walked through the familiar streets of the neighborhood, but each shadow seemed to hide secrets. Each noise made her quicken her pace. She could swear she heard footsteps behind her, always maintaining the same distance, always stopping when she stopped. When she finally reached her small building, Antonella ran up the 3 flights of stairs, locking the door as soon as she entered her apartment. She leaned against the door, breathing heavily, feeling ridiculous and frightened at the same time. "He is a dangerous man," she said aloud to the empty apartment, as if saying the words could make them less terrifying. "And I shouldn't be thinking about him." The next morning, Antonella arrived at the community center determined to forget the events of the past few days and focus on what really mattered, the children who needed her help. She had barely finished opening the rooms when she heard a familiar little voice calling her name. She turned and almost dropped her keys when she saw Isabella running toward her, followed by a middle-aged woman, whom Antonella recognized as the nanny from the mansion. The girl threw herself into her arms with a joy that made Antonella's heart both warm and break at the same time. "I told Daddy I wanted to play with the other children," said Isabella, her eyes shining with a happiness that contrasted with the total confusion Antonella felt. "He said I could come if the pretty lady was here." The nanny approached with a polite smile, but Antonella could see the tension in her shoulders, as if she were following orders she didn't completely understand. "Mr. Greco asked me to bring little Isabella to play with the other children," the woman explained, her voice carrying the kind of neutrality that comes from years of serving in houses where questions are not welcome. Antonella felt her mind spinning in circles, trying to understand why Pietro would allow Isabella to return to the center, why he would risk exposing his daughter to the simple world she represented. There was something behind that decision, something she couldn't decipher, but that made her stomach tighten with nervousness. "Of course she can stay," Antonella said, trying to keep her voice steady while caressing Isabella's silky hair. But for how long? The hours passed in a strange haze, with Antonella divided between the genuine joy of having Isabella around and the growing anxiety about the motivations behind it all. She watched the girl play with the other children, noticing how Isabella easily adapted to the simpler environment, sharing broken toys and eating common cookie snacks as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But there were moments when Antonella caught her looking at the door, as if she were waiting for someone specific to appear. The nanny remained seated in a corner the entire time, observing everything with attentive eyes, and Antonella couldn't shake the feeling that she too was being watched, evaluated somehow. She's waiting for him to show up, Antonella thought, and was startled to realize that she was waiting too. The late afternoon came too quickly, and Antonella felt a knot in her stomach when she saw the nanny stand up to start packing Isabella's things. The other children had already gone, leaving the community center immersed in a quietness that amplified every sound. Isabella hugged Antonella tightly, whispering softly that she wanted to come back the next day, and Antonella had to swallow the emotion that threatened to overflow. "I don't know if it will be possible, little one," she said, caressing the girl's face and trying not to think about how difficult it would be not to see her again. "It depends on your daddy." The words came out loaded with an anticipated longing she didn't expect to feel. That's when she saw him. Pietro was standing at the entrance of the community center, leaning against the doorframe with a casual elegance that completely contrasted with the simple environment around him. He wore an impeccable dark suit, but there was something different about him. Perhaps it was the way his shoulders seemed less rigid, or how his eyes didn't carry the cutting coldness she remembered. Isabella ran to him shouting, "Daddy," and Antonella watched, fascinated, the instant transformation on his face when he knelt down to receive his daughter. "How was your day, little princess?" he asked, his voice carrying a tenderness that made something stir dangerously in Antonella's chest. "The pretty lady let me play with all the children," Isabella replied, pointing to Antonella with evident pride. Pietro rose slowly, his eyes meeting Antonella's over Isabella's head, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. There was something different in his gaze, an intensity that wasn't exactly coldness but wasn't warmth either. It was something more complex, more dangerous. He took a few steps toward her, his presence filling the small space of the center in a way that made Antonella feel simultaneously protected and vulnerable. "Isabella insisted on coming back," he said, his voice low and controlled. "She talked about you all the time this week, about how you made her feel safe." The words hung in the air between them, laden with layers of meaning that neither was ready to explore. Antonella felt the blush rise up her neck as she tried to process what that confession meant. Pietro had allowed Isabella to return because the girl had talked about her, because somehow she had marked that child's life in a way he considered important. "She is special," Antonella said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "All children are, but Isabella has something different, a strength she shouldn't need to have at such a young age." She saw something pass through his eyes, recognition perhaps, or an old pain that he carried like an invisible burden. "You see things that most people don't see," Pietro said, and there was an unformulated question in his words, as if he were trying to understand how she could read between the lines of his life. The silence that followed was charged with tension, and Antonella found herself hypnotized by the way Pietro observed her every movement, as if he were memorizing details he considered important. She noticed how he unconsciously positioned himself between her and the door, not in a threatening way, but protectively, as if some primitive instinct compelled him to keep himself between her and any potential danger. "May I ask a question?" said Antonella, surprising herself with her own courage. "Why did you really let Isabella come back here? I'm sure a child in her position has access to the best clubs, the best schools, the best of everything. Why a community center in a humble neighborhood?" The question hung between them, and Antonella saw his jaw tighten slightly. Pietro remained silent for long seconds, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he was internally debating how much he could reveal. "Isabella spent 5 years surrounded by people who treat her like an untouchable little princess," he finally said, his voice carrying an honesty that surprised her. "In 3 days with you, she learned what it means to be treated like a normal child. That's something I can't give her, no matter how much money I have." Antonella felt something tighten in her chest. There was pain in those words, an admission of failure that must cost a man like him a lot to verbalize. "You gave her something I didn't know she was missing," he continued, and Antonella realized that this was as much a confession as it was a thank you. The nanny approached discreetly, indicating it was time to go, and Antonella felt a pang of disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. Isabella hugged her once more, making her promise she would return the next day, and Antonella looked questioningly at Pietro. "If she wants to come back, she can come back," he said, his voice carrying a decision that seemed to have been made right there, in that moment. "But only if you agree. I don't want you to feel obligated to anything." The consideration in his words made something flutter in Antonella's stomach, a strange and dangerous sensation that she tried to ignore. "Isabella will always be welcome here," she said, trying to keep her voice professional while her heart beat erratically. Pietro nodded, extending his hand to Isabella, who obediently went to him. Antonella watched them prepare to leave, noticing how father and daughter moved with a natural synchronization that spoke of deep love, even amid all the complications she could only imagine. "See you tomorrow," said Isabella, waving animatedly, and Antonella waved back, already missing the girl's contagious energy. Pietro stopped at the door, turning one last time to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made the air seem thicker. "Thank you," he said simply. But the word carried enough weight to make Antonella understand that he wasn't just talking about taking care of Isabella. When they left, Antonella was alone in the community center, trying to process everything that had happened. She mechanically tidied the rooms, putting away toys and organizing chairs, but her mind was completely focused on the conversation she had just had with Pietro. Something was changing between them, something she didn't know whether to encourage or fear. He wasn't just the dangerous, cold man she had met a week ago. There were layers to him, depths she was just beginning to glimpse. "This is dangerous," she whispered to herself, but even saying the words, she couldn't deny the magnetic attraction she felt toward him. He's the kind of man who can destroy a life without even noticing. Antonella finished tidying the center and headed for the back door where she always locked everything before leaving. She fiddled with the lock, hearing the familiar click that indicated everything was secure, when a strange feeling made her turn slowly. Across the street, casually leaning against a dark car she hadn't noticed before, was Pietro. He didn't try to hide his presence, didn't pretend to be doing something else. He simply watched her with that intensity that made her skin tingle. When their eyes met across the distance, he didn't look away, didn't wave, didn't smile. He just stood there watching, waiting, like a silent guardian she hadn't asked for, but somehow knew she needed. "What are you doing to me?" thought Antonella, her heart racing as she wondered how long he would stay there, how long she could pretend that his presence didn't affect her in ways she couldn't understand. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a man in a suit, who simply placed the golden envelope in Antonella's hands and left without saying a word. She opened it with trembling fingers, reading the elegant words printed on expensive paper that invited her to a charity event at the most luxurious hotel in the city. At the end, a single handwritten line in firm masculine calligraphy: "It would be good for the community center to gain visibility. Greco." Antonella read the message 3 times, trying to decipher the true intentions behind those formal words. There was something more there, something he wasn't saying directly, a hidden layer that made her question if this was really about the community center. "Why does he care so much about my work?" she murmured, holding the invitation against her chest while feeling her heart inexplicably racing. On the night of the event, Antonella stood in front of the mirror in her small room, adjusting for the 10th time the only formal dress she owned. It was a simple navy blue dress, bought years ago for her college graduation, and she felt like a child trying to wear adult clothes. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied a bit of lipstick, the only makeup she knew how to use with confidence, and she wondered once more why she had accepted that invitation. The truth she didn't want to admit was that the possibility of seeing Pietro again, outside the controlled environment of the community center, excited her in a way that should have frightened her. "You're getting yourself into something much bigger than you," she said to her reflection, but still grabbed her small purse and left home. "And maybe that's exactly what you're looking for." The hotel was everything Antonella expected, and a bit more. A monument to luxury that made her feel tiny in the golden marble entrance. Men in tuxedos and women in expensive dresses circulated through the lobby, their laughter echoing like refined music she didn't know how to dance to. Antonella showed the invitation at the reception, trying to ignore the slightly surprised look from the employee upon seeing her name on the guest list, and was escorted to the main hall. The first thing she saw upon entering was Pietro, standing near the bar, the black tuxedo making him look even more imposing than usual. When their eyes met across the crowded hall, she felt as if the entire world had stopped for a moment. "So you came," he said when he approached, his voice carrying something that could have been relief, but it was difficult to be certain with a man who hid so many secrets behind those dark eyes. Pietro guided her through the event with a firm but gentle hand on her back, introducing her to people whose names she forgot as soon as she heard them. She noticed how he never strayed far from her, always maintaining a distance that allowed him to appear in seconds if she needed rescue from some uncomfortable conversation. There was something protective in the way he observed her, as if she were a precious treasure that could be stolen if he lowered his guard for a moment. "You don't need to take care of me," said Antonella during a pause between introductions, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I know," replied Pietro, his eyes never leaving her face, "but that doesn't mean I won't do it." The intensity in his voice made something flutter in Antonella's stomach, a dangerous sensation she tried to suppress without success. It was then that she saw him, Dr. Cesare, the volunteer doctor, who had started helping at the community center a few weeks ago. He was tall, blonde, with a warm smile that completely contrasted with Pietro's shadowy presence. Cesare approached them with confident steps, his eyes lighting up when he saw Antonella, and she felt a wave of relief at seeing a familiar face amid so many strangers. "Antonella, what a wonderful surprise to find you here," said Cesare, kissing her hand in a gallant way that made her blush slightly. "You look absolutely stunning tonight." Antonella felt Pietro tense beside her, a subtle change in the atmosphere that made her glance quickly at him, noticing how his jaw had clenched almost imperceptibly. "Doctor, Cesare also volunteers at the center," explained Antonella to Pietro, not knowing why she felt the need to make that formal introduction. The tension between the two men was palpable, an electric current that Antonella could feel, even without fully understanding its origin. Cesare extended his hand to Pietro with a professional smile, but there was something challenging in his eyes that didn't go unnoticed. "Pietro Greco," said Pietro simply, shaking the offered hand with a strength that made Cesare blink quickly. "I've heard a lot about your philanthropic work," Cesare lied smoothly, and Antonella realized that he had no idea who Pietro really was, of the dangerous world he represented. "I'm sure it is," replied Pietro, his voice carrying an icy tone that made Antonella shiver. "I hope your intentions with the center are as noble as they appear to be." When the music started playing, Cesare immediately asked Antonella to dance, and she accepted before even thinking about it, mainly to escape the suffocating tension that had settled between the two men. Cesare was a competent dancer, guiding her across the floor with smooth movements that made her laugh genuinely for the first time since she had arrived at the event. He told funny stories about his patients, made light jokes about the other guests, and for a few minutes Antonella managed to forget where she was and who she had come with. "You should laugh more," said Cesare, twirling her gracefully. "Your laughter is contagious." Antonella smiled, feeling more relaxed than she had felt in weeks, but there was something in the back of her mind that prevented her from completely surrendering to that moment of lightness. "Sometimes it's hard to find reasons to laugh," she admitted, and Cesare pulled her slightly closer. From across the room, Pietro watched every movement of the dance with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, and he could barely maintain the neutral expression that years of practice had taught him to use as a mask. There was something primitive and wild growing in his chest, an emotion he hadn't felt for so long that he had almost forgotten how it consumed him from within. Each time Cesare whispered something in Antonella's ear and she laughed, Pietro felt as if something was being slowly torn from him, piece by piece. "She's not yours," he told himself, trying to use logic to contain the storm growing inside him. "You have no right to feel this." But his body wasn't listening to his mind, and his feet had already begun to move toward the dance floor before he could control himself. When Cesare leaned in to whisper something in Antonella's ear, something inside Pietro simply broke. He crossed the room with firm and determined steps. completely ignoring the people who tried to greet him along the way. His vision was focused only on Antonella and the man who was too close to her for his liking. "Excuse me," Pietro said when he reached their side, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "I need to speak with Antonella." It wasn't a request, it was a statement, and the icy tone in his voice made Cesare take an involuntary step back. Antonella looked at Pietro with surprise, noticing something wild in his eyes that she had never seen before, something that made her forget how to breathe for a moment. "Now," added Pietro, extending his hand to her in a way that left no room for discussion. Antonella took the offered hand, immediately feeling the tension that ran through Pietro's body like an electric current. He guided her out of the ballroom without saying a word, his fingers intertwined with hers with a firmness that made her feel simultaneously safe and in danger. They walked in silence through the hotel corridors until they reached a private garden where fragrant rose bushes created an intimate environment under the soft light of strategically positioned lamps. "What was that?" asked Antonella as soon as they stopped, turning to face him. But the words died in her throat when she saw the expression on his face. There was something raw and vulnerable there, an emotion so intense that she could feel it emanating from him like heat. "You were enjoying yourself," said Pietro, and there was an accusation in his voice that she couldn't fully understand. Yes, I was enjoying myself," replied Antonella, her own voice beginning to rise as a spark of irritation cut through her confusion. "Cesare is a kind and funny man, and I was having a normal conversation with a friend. Why does that bother you so much?" She saw his jaw clench again, his eyes darkening even more as he took a step toward her. "Because he doesn't know you," said Pietro, his voice hoarse and intense. "He doesn't know what you look like when you're worried about a child, how your eyes shine when you manage to help someone, how you bite your lower lip when you're nervous." Each word was pronounced like a confession torn by force, and Antonella realized that he had been observing her much more attentively than she had imagined. "He doesn't know that you drink 3 cups of coffee in the morning because you don't sleep well at night," continued Pietro, now so close that she could feel the heat of his body, "or that you always check twice if the doors are locked because you're afraid of the dark." The silence that followed was charged with such intense tension that Antonella could hear her own heart beating in her ears. Pietro was now so close that she could see the small lines around his eyes, could smell his masculine cologne enveloping her like an invisible net. "How do you know all this about me?" she whispered, her voice coming out weaker than she intended, but there was a part of her that already knew the answer, that understood he had been observing her, studying her, learning her in a way that should frighten her, but instead made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. "Because I can't stop thinking about you," Pietro admitted, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "Since the moment you walked into my house with my daughter in your arms, you haven't left my mind." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. That's when it happened. Pietro leaned toward her, his eyes fixed on her lips, and Antonella felt all the air leave her lungs. The kiss, when it finally happened, was anything but gentle. It was intense, possessive, desperate, as if years of repressed desire had exploded all at once. Antonella surrendered to him for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, her fingers tangling in the fabric of his tuxedo as he held her against him as if she might disappear at any moment. There was something wild and primitive in that kiss, something that spoke of needs that went far beyond mere physical attraction. "God, Antonella," Pietro murmured against her lips, his voice hoarse with desire and something that might have been despair. "What are you doing to me?" But then, as abruptly as it had begun, he pulled away, his eyes filled with something that looked very much like fear. Pietro took 2 steps back, running his hands through his hair in a rare display of lack of control, and Antonella could see the internal war raging on his face. "This was a mistake," he said, but his voice trembled slightly, contradicting his own words. "I shouldn't have. You shouldn't be here, shouldn't be near me." There was genuine pain in his voice, a vulnerability he was trying to hide behind the cold mask he was quickly putting back in place. Antonella felt her heart break a little, seeing how he was withdrawing, as if the moment of connection they had shared was something he should be ashamed of. "Pietro," she began, reaching out toward him, but he shook his head, backing away even further. "You should go back inside," he said, his voice now distant and controlled. Cesare is waiting for you." The words were like a slap, and Antonella felt tears threatening to rise in her eyes. He turned and began to walk away, leaving Antonella alone in the fragrant garden, her heart racing and her lips still tingling with the taste of him. She touched her own lips with trembling fingers, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how something so intense and right could be treated as a mistake. Confusion and pain mixed in her chest, creating a knot that prevented her from breathing properly. What kind of man kisses a woman like that and then acts like it was a mistake? She thought. But even as she asked herself this question, a part of her understood that there was much more going on here than she could see. He moved away first, leaving her in the garden with more questions than answers. But the taste of danger still burned on her lips, reminding her that some things, once tasted, could never be forgotten. The following days passed in a fog of silence that Antonella didn't know how to interpret. She arrived at the community center every morning, expecting to see Isabella running toward her with that luminous smile. But the girl simply didn't appear. No explanation, no message, no sign that Pietro even remembered he had promised to let his daughter return. Antonella found herself looking out the window at every car sound, her heart momentarily racing before plummeting when she realized it wasn't him. Isabella's absence hurt more than she expected, but it was Pietro's absence that left her truly lost. Maybe that kiss really was a mistake, she whispered to herself, but even saying the words, she couldn't make her heart believe them. On the third day without news, Antonella finally gave in and called the Greco mansion. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number she had memorized without realizing it, and her stomach churned with nervousness as she waited for someone to answer. A formal female voice answered, probably the housekeeper, and when Antonella asked about Isabella, she was coldly informed that the family was not receiving visitors and that there was no forecast for resuming activities at the community center. The line was cut before Antonella could ask more questions, leaving her with the silent phone in her hand and a growing emptiness in her chest. "He's avoiding me," she murmured, and the realization hurt more than any direct rejection would have. Did that kiss scare him so much? While Antonella struggled against the confusion and hurt that grew each day, Pietro was locked in his office at the mansion, immersed in an internal war that completely consumed him. He had spent the last 72 hours trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing by distancing himself from her. But each time he closed his eyes, he could taste Antonella's lips, could hear the small sigh she had released when he kissed her. Important papers piled up on his desk, meetings were cancelled, and Isabella asked daily when she could see the pretty lady again, but Pietro couldn't escape the mental labyrinth he had entered. "She's too good for this world," he told himself, repeating the words like a mantra that should protect her from himself, "and I'm too dangerous for hers." The truth Pietro didn't want to admit was that Antonella had awakened in him feelings he had buried years ago, feelings that had no place in the life he had built. Men like him didn't have the luxury of loving innocent women, couldn't drag angels to hell just because they felt lonely in the darkness. He knew his own world, knew the dangers that surrounded everyone who came too close to him, and the idea that Antonella might become a target because of feelings he couldn't control terrified him more than any threat he had ever faced. "She deserves someone like that doctor," he thought, remembering Cesare and feeling a pang of jealousy he tried to suppress immediately. Someone who can give her a normal, safe life, without shadows. On the 5th day of silence, Pietro finally made a decision he hoped would be definitive. He called his financial assistant and ordered a substantial transfer to the community center's account, an amount that would allow Antonella to expand her projects and help even more children. Along with the transfer, he sent a formal note, typed and impersonal, to continue the good work. Greco. There was no personal touch, no reference to the moments they had shared, no explanation for his sudden disappearance. It was a farewell disguised as a donation, a way to say goodbye without having to look into her eyes and see the pain he knew he had caused. This will resolve everything, he told himself, but the words sounded hollow even in his own ears. When Antonella received notification of the bank transfer and read the attached note, she felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. The money was more than the community center received in an entire year, an amount that could change the lives of hundreds of children, but all she could see was the coldness of the typed words. There wasn't a single handwritten letter, no sign of the intimacy that had grown between them, no acknowledgement of the kiss that had changed everything between them. It was as if Pietro was paying a debt and ending any obligation he might feel toward her. "So this is how it ends," she whispered, holding the paper with hands that trembled with hurt and humiliation. "He buys me off and discards me, as if I were just another responsibility he wants to rid himself of." The painful realization that Pietro had said goodbye to her, without even having the courage to do it in person, was the catalyst Antonella needed to make a decision she had been avoiding for weeks. She had received a job offer from a non-governmental organization in another city, an opportunity she had briefly considered before Pietro and Isabella entered her life. Now, with a broken heart and wounded pride, that proposal seemed the only dignified way out of a situation that was consuming her from within. "I won't stay here waiting for crumbs of attention from a man who doesn't even have the courage to finish what he started," she told herself, already pulling the suitcase from under the bed. "If he wants to pay me to get out of his life, I'll accept the money and use it to start over far from here." Antonella spent the night packing, each piece of clothing folded with a fierce determination that masked the pain threatening to overflow at any moment. She called to accept the job offer in the other city, her fingers firm on the phone even when her voice threatened to falter. The job would start the following Monday, giving her only 3 days to organize her life and leave. It was enough time to escape before courage abandoned her, enough time to leave the city before Pietro could discover her plans and try to stop her, if he cared enough to do that. 3 days to erase 2 months of illusions, she muttered, closing the suitcase with more force than necessary. 3 days to become again the woman I was before meeting him. The following morning, Antonella woke up with a determination she hadn't felt in days. She wrote a simple letter to Pietro, aware that it would be the last communication between them. The words were carefully chosen, each phrase weighted with meanings she hoped he would understand. "Isabella will always be welcome at the community center. Take good care of her. The money will be used to help the children who need it most. Thank you for reminding me that some worlds never mix. Antonella." She sealed the letter in a simple envelope, wrote only Pietro Greco on the front, and headed to the mansion for the last time. "If he doesn't want to see me, at least he'll know I left with dignity," she thought, handing the letter to the doorman with instructions that it be delivered personally. Pietro was in his office when the butler brought the letter, and something in his chest contracted as soon as he saw the delicate, feminine handwriting on the envelope. He opened it with slightly trembling fingers, reading the few lines several times before the full meaning of the words penetrated his mind. Antonella was leaving. She had understood the message he had tried to send with the donation, and was saying goodbye with the same dignity she had always shown. The phrase about worlds that never mix cut deeper than any direct accusation would have, because it showed that she had understood exactly what he was trying to do, and that she had accepted his decision. "This is what I wanted," he said to himself, but the words sounded like lies even in his own ears. "To protect her from me, to give her the chance to have a normal life." But if that's what he wanted, why did it feel like something was being torn from his chest? Pietro rose from his chair abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the street, trying to process the reality that Antonella was really leaving his life. He had achieved what he thought he wanted: distance, safety for her, protection from the dangers his world represented. But the victory tasted bitter, and the emptiness that had settled in his chest since he had distanced himself from her had become a black hole that threatened to consume him completely. "Men like me don't deserve women like her," he repeated, the mantra that had become his justification for everything, but the words no longer brought the comfort he expected. "But perhaps women like her are what make men like me want to be different." Isabella appeared at the office door at that moment, her large, curious eyes fixed on her father's tense face. "Daddy, when are we going to see the pretty lady again?" asked the girl, and the innocence of the question was like a stab in Pietro's heart. He knelt down to his daughter's height, trying to find words to explain something he himself couldn't fully understand. "The pretty lady is busy now, little one," he said, hating every word that came out of his mouth. "She has important work to do." Isabella frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the answer, and Pietro saw in his daughter's eyes a disappointment that perfectly mirrored what he felt inside. "But she promised I could come back and play there," insisted Isabella, and Pietro had to look away so the girl wouldn't see how his own decisions were destroying him. "Sometimes promises change, Isabella," he said, and hated how cynical the words sounded coming from his mouth. That afternoon, Pietro found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, driving aimlessly through the city streets, trying to escape his own thoughts. His feet led him, almost without him realizing it, to the neighborhood where Antonella lived, and he found himself parked across the street from her small building. He didn't know what he expected to find there, but when he saw Antonella leaving the building carrying 2 suitcases, the reality of the situation hit him like a high-speed train. She was really leaving. It wasn't a bluff, it wasn't an attempt to call him back. It was a real, definitive, final goodbye. "I did this," he thought, watching her struggle with the weight of the suitcases while trying to lock the door. "I pushed her away from me and now she's leaving forever." Pietro watched Antonella wave down an approaching taxi, and every movement she made seemed to happen in slow motion. He could get out of the car, could cross the street, could stop her from leaving, could finally say the words that had been accumulating in his chest for weeks. But he remained motionless, fingers gripping the steering wheel, remembering all the reasons why he had made the decision to stay away from her. She deserved better than him, deserved a life without shadows, without dangers, without the destructive complexity that came with men like him. The taxi stopped. The driver got out to help her with the bags, and Pietro felt as if he was watching his own execution. Let her go, he told himself, but every fiber of his being screamed for him to do the opposite. If you really love her, let her have the life she deserves. Antonella got into the taxi and closed the door, and Pietro saw through the back window how she looked one last time at the building where she had lived, then at the street where she had so often walked, thinking of him. For a terrible moment, he thought she had seen him, that their eyes had met across the distance and the dark glass of his car. But then the taxi began to move, taking her away from him, away from the city, away from everything they had shared. Pietro remained there, standing at the window of his car, until the tail lights of the taxi completely disappeared around the curve of the street. "It's over," he whispered to the silence of the empty car, but the words didn't bring the relief he had expected. She closed the taxi door and he didn't try to stop her, but stayed there at the window until the lights completely disappeared, feeling as if an essential part of himself had left along with her. The train station was busy that Monday morning, people carrying luggage and dreams to unknown destinations, but Antonella felt completely isolated amid the crowd. She held her ticket with slightly trembling fingers, eyes fixed on the train slowly approaching the platform, bringing with it the promise of a new life away from everything that had hurt her. Her suitcase was at her feet, containing all her possessions and hopes to start over somewhere where the name Greco meant nothing. 20 minutes and all this will be behind me, she whispered to herself, trying to gather courage for the final step that would take her away from him forever. The train stopped with a hiss of steam, and the doors opened, releasing passengers who came from other cities, other lives, other love stories. Antonella observed the people moving around her, welcoming hugs and goodbyes that seemed so natural, so different from the painful complexity that her life had become since she met Pietro. She picked up her suitcase, taking one last look at the city that had seen her grow, work, dream, and fall in love with the wrong man. In a few months, this will all be just a memory, she thought, trying to convince herself that the pain would eventually pass. And maybe I'll stop wondering what would have happened if he had been brave enough to fight for me. It was then that she heard it, familiar footsteps running across the platform, a rhythm that her heart recognized even before her mind could process what was happening. Antonella turned slowly, almost afraid to confirm what her senses had already captured, and when her eyes found the figure approaching at a run, she felt as if the entire world had stopped spinning. Pietro was there, but he was a Pietro she had never seen before. Without the impeccable suit, just a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves and dark pants, his black hair slightly disheveled as if he had rushed out of the house without caring about his appearance. He came, she thought, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. After everything, he really came. Pietro stopped a few meters away from her, breathless, as if he had run an entire marathon to get there. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, and Antonella could see the effort it was costing him to be there, to expose himself in that way after having spent days hiding behind walls of coldness and distance. When he finally spoke, his voice came out broken, filled with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I can't," he whispered, and each word seemed to be torn from somewhere deep inside him that he had tried to keep locked away. "I tried to forget you, tried to protect you from me, but I can't." Antonella felt her suitcase slip from her fingers and fall to the ground with a muffled sound, but she didn't even notice. Her eyes were fixed on Pietro's face, seeing for the first time all the layers of pain and desire that he had hidden behind the mask of control. There were tears threatening to overflow from his eyes, a sight so rare that she felt her own heart break and rebuild itself at the same time. "Pietro," she whispered, but he shook his head as if he were fighting against inner demons that she couldn't see. "Let me finish," he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion, "because if I don't say this now, I might never have the courage to say it again." "My world is dangerous," Pietro continued, taking a hesitant step toward her, as if he were approaching something sacred that could break if he moved too quickly. "Full of shadows you don't deserve to know, full of people who don't understand the goodness that exists in you. I wanted to protect you from that, wanted to give you the chance to have a normal life with someone who could give you the peace you deserve." His words were like a confession torn by force, each syllable loaded with weeks of internal torment and sleepless nights. "But the truth is that without you I am nothing," he admitted, and the vulnerability in those words made something move in Antonella's chest. "You reminded me of who I was before I lost myself in this world." The second train whistle echoed through the station, more insistent this time, and Antonella felt the urgency of the moment pressing against her like a physical force. People around them began moving toward the carriages, but Antonella remained motionless, hypnotized by the intensity of Pietro's gaze. "I know I have no right to ask you this," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I hurt you with my fear and my cowardice. I know you deserve someone better, someone who doesn't come with all the complications I bring." He reached out his hand toward her, but stopped mid-movement as if unsure if he had permission to touch her. "But if you can forgive me, stay with me, Antonella. In my world, by my side, forever." Pietro's outstretched hand hovered in the air between them, like a bridge she could choose to cross or ignore. Antonella looked at those long fingers that had touched her face with tenderness, that had held hers when she was nervous, that had trembled with desire when he kissed her in that perfumed garden. Then she looked into his eyes, those dark eyes that always seemed to guard secrets, but that now were completely open to her, showing all the vulnerability, all the love, all the fear he carried. The third and final train whistle sounded, more urgent than the previous ones, and Antonella knew she had seconds to decide between the safety of the unknown and the passionate uncertainty of true love. "All women dream of a moment like this," she said to herself. Without taking her eyes from his, Antonella extended her own hand and touched Pietro's fingers, immediately feeling the electric discharge that always happened when they touched. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if savoring the first sip of water after days in the desert, and when he opened them again, there was such deep gratitude there that it made Antonella's heart contract with emotion. "Your world may be dangerous," she said, her voice firm despite the tears that began to flow down her cheeks, "but without you, my world makes no sense." She intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the strength and tenderness in those hands. The train began to move behind her, taking away the life she had planned, but Antonella didn't look back even once. "I forgive you," she whispered, "and I choose you, with all your shadows." Pietro pulled her into his arms with an urgency that spoke of weeks of repressed longing, holding her against him as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Antonella could feel his heart beating erratically against her chest, could feel the tremor in his hands as he caressed her hair, could hear the broken whispers of gratitude he murmured in her ear. "I thought I had lost you forever," he confessed, his voice choked. "Thought my pride and my fear had destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Antonella stepped back slightly to look into his eyes, seeing there a silent promise that he would never let her go again. "You almost lost," she said, a small and trembling smile playing on her lips. "But apparently we're both braver than we thought." Weeks had passed since that day at the station, and Antonella still woke some mornings hardly believing that her life had changed so drastically. The Greco mansion had become her home in a way she never imagined possible, not because of the luxury surrounding her, but because of the small intimacies she had built with Pietro and Isabella. She was on the main veranda that sunny afternoon, watching Isabella play in the garden with the naturalness of a child who had finally found the balance between protection and freedom. The little girl had flourished since Antonella moved into the mansion, seeming happier and more relaxed than ever. She needed a maternal figure, thought Antonella, feeling a wave of affection as she watched Isabella teach a doll how to plant flowers in the flower bed. Pietro approached silently from behind her, as he always did when he just wanted to be close without interrupting her thoughts. Antonella felt his strong arms close around her waist, pulling her against the broad chest that had become her favorite refuge in the world. He said nothing, just rested his chin on her shoulder and watched Isabella play, and Antonella realized that these moments of shared silence had become as precious as the passionate words they exchanged when they were alone. "She asked if she could call you Mum," Pietro murmured in her ear, his voice carrying a tenderness that still surprised her at times. "I told her she should ask you first." Antonella felt tears of happiness threatening to well up in her eyes. "And what would you answer if she asked?" Pietro questioned. "I would answer that it would be the greatest honor of my life," said Antonella, her voice choked with emotion, "because she is as special as her father." Pietro turned her in his arms so that she faced him, his dark eyes shining with a happiness she had learned to recognize and love. "I love you," he said simply. But the words carried all the weight of the weeks of separation that had almost destroyed them, all the relief of having found her in time, all the gratitude for a second chance they almost didn't get. Antonella smiled, bringing her hands to his face, tracing with her fingers the lines that worry had created around his eyes. "I love you too," she replied, "and I love the life we're building together." She leaned in to kiss him softly, a kiss that tasted of fulfilled promises and shared futures. When they separated, Pietro held her hand in his, intertwining their fingers in a way that had become an automatic gesture between them. Antonella noticed how he looked at their intertwined hands, as if he still couldn't quite believe that she had chosen to stay, that she had accepted all the complications that came with loving a man like him. "Sometimes I'm still afraid of waking up and discovering this was all a dream," he confessed, his vulnerability a gift he offered only to her. "Sometimes I still can't believe you forgave me for being so cowardly." Antonella squeezed his hand harder, a gentle pressure that had become her way of reminding him that she wasn't going anywhere. "We all fear different things," she said. "You were afraid of hurting me, I was afraid of not being enough for your world. But true love is stronger than any fear." He held her hand like someone who would never let go again, and this time she didn't want him to let go. Did you enjoy Antonella and Pietro's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.